Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. I guess this new year in Esoteric Political History. My name is Jody Avirgan, and this is our first episode of 2021. So Happy New Year, Nikki.
Happy New Year. What have you been getting up to in 2021? Is it brighter than 2020 for you?
I don't know. I believe in the psychic energy of turning a new page, but I think the first half of 2021 will feel a lot like 2020, and so let's celebrate New Year in like June or July when things have really started to flip a new page. How about that?
I have a feeling that there will be many celebrations in the back half of 2021.
Yes. Oh my gosh, the number of things I'm just putting off and putting. Yeah, I almost booked a vacation for like the fall, and then
really
I was like
playing with fire there.
Yeah, exactly. Playing with Miles there. So yes, we are here in a new year, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us in a new year. We're going to talk about what we're going to talk about today in a second, but I just want to say we're very excited for what's on deck with this year. Excited to do it in a new year. We also have a big announcement about the show coming up in a little bit. So yeah, there is a lot to look forward to with this show in the new year. And last week, I do want to say one thing. Last week we ran some reruns of our favorite shows from 2020. We got a lot of good feedback from that, including the fact that we ran this episode that we both really loved about the Koya Come Home letter, which was in Minnesota. A husband wrote a letter to his wife, who was a representative, saying basically leave politics, come back to your domestic duties. And in that episode, I pronounced her last name as Knutson. And at the time, a number of people wrote in to say that I had pronounced that incorrectly. And then I forgot to fix it in the rerun. So it was a nice way to end 2020 and go into the new year with people telling me that it is actually pronounced Knutson, which is a very Minnesota way of pronouncing it. And, you know, look, it was our only error of the entire year. We happened to put it into a rerun. But let's see if we can go
that
this
one,
year. Yeah,
that one
just
error.
The only single mistake we made the entire year. But Koya Knutson, and I just like saying that, Knutson.
It's really
anyway.
fun to say.
No mistakes from here on out. So today's episode, this day, January 5th, it's actually January 6th, 1961 that we're going to look at. And this is the day that Vice President Richard Nixon, as the president of the Senate, presided over a congressional tally of the previous year's presidential election result, in which John F. Kennedy had defeated him, Richard Nixon. Nixon noted that he was the first vice president since 1860 to declare his opponent the winner, but this is the job of the president of the Senate. And he went on to say, listen to this quote, "No matter how hard they may be, no matter how close the election may turn out to be, those who lose accept the verdict and support those who win." So, listeners, I've walked you right up to the very obvious reason that we are doing this episode at this moment, given the apparent fiasco that is certifying the 2020 election. But this 1961 race also has a lot more interesting parallels than I kind of realized, because it's not just about Nixon presiding and preserving this role for the Senate in certifying an election. But there was actually a fight up until this moment on behalf of Nixon's supporters to contest the results of the election. There were allegations of fraud, conspiracy theories about the results in a bunch of different states. So lots of other ways that this makes us think of this moment. So, Nikki, this feels like a good one to start with. And you want to start there, actually, and then we'll work our way to the certification. We have a 1960 election. It's very close. And then almost immediately after, there are allegations of fraud.
Yeah, this is a super close election. There's something like 130,000 votes that separate these two men. That works out to about 0.2 percentage point of the popular vote. It's a little wider margin in the Electoral College, but whisper thin. And so there is a challenge, in a number of states, I think about 11 of them, but 2 of them in particular, Texas and Illinois, because these were seen as sort of hotbeds of Democratic malfeasance. You have in Illinois, Chicago, which is run by the Daley machine, a real suspicion that Daley is trying to flip the election for John Kennedy. And then Texas, which is a place where Lyndon Johnson, the vice presidential candidate, was from. And there had been allegations on the right for years that Lyndon Johnson had cheated his way into office. And so these were pretty target-rich environments for Republicans who were trying to overturn the results of the election.
Yeah. And I mean, it is worth saying that pointing to Illinois machine politics and saying, hey, there might have been something fishy going on here was not that outrageous of a claim.
Yeah, I mean, U.S. politics has not been up until 2020 this perfect march of high respect for democracy and for free and fair elections in a lot of ways. But machine politics definitely had some shenanigans going on in the voting booth.
And again, I think it's a reminder that when elections are very close, they create both reasonable and just sort of a narrative vacuum into which these kinds of charges can come out. The Texas allegation is very interesting, too, because it has, as you said, to do with the Johnson connection, who was Kennedy's vice president. But also there's some ballot confusion there. So we're starting to realize all of the possible ways in which elections can be confusing and contested are really present in this 1960 story.
Yeah, we should tell listeners who still have flashbacks to those butterfly ballots of the 2000 election that they need to brace themselves, because what was happening in Texas is that they had something called the negative ballot. And the negative ballot, here's what you had to do. You had to go through and you had to cross out the names of the people that you didn't want to vote for.
My God. It is stunning.
Ridiculous.
Stunning. I mean, I'm a good government person. I have gotten very into ballot design questions in the past, and I think that ballot design, as we saw in 2000, but just in general, the New York State's ballot, it's always really poorly designed. But this is just a whole nother level. This puts our ballot design conversation in a bit of context, gives us some perspective. But who thought of that? Who thought that was a good idea? Cross out every name of the people you don't want to vote for.
I mean, you have to think that there are some, to use the word shenanigans again, shenanigans involved with the ballot design itself, that there's a political reason why you make voting difficult. And here you go.
Yeah. So look, Nixon does on TV at 4 a.m. on election night concede, or he says he doesn't exactly concede. He
concede-ishes.
Yeah, he concede-ishes. He says basically, that if this is expected to go his way, and he will have my support if so. 3 days after the election, a Kentucky Senator, Thurston B. Morton, announced proceedings to question the result in 11 states. Among his many claims, we've discussed some of them, Illinois and Texas, he also claimed that the RNC had received 35,000 letters and telegrams with anecdotal accounts of fraud. And to me, again, this reminds me, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of who this coterie of people around Nixon that emerges are. But it does remind me that, as we're seeing now, you can build a story with a combination of anecdotal evidence, conspiracy theory, some real questions. And we see that happening in this 1960 race, that people decided, okay, you know what? There's enough here. They start from their suspicions and then they build the case kind of backwards from there.
Yeah, I mean, Nixon is surrounded by his operatives. So there are people in the RNC, and there are people who are close Nixon aides who are all working on this project of looking if there's a way to overturn the results in certain states, but also feeding the storyline that something hinky happened with the election. And you can imagine how this takes roots. First of all, just that people really, really want to win. They don't trust Democratic politicians. The election is so close. So it's one of those moments where you're like, oh, if we could just change the tiniest thing, then maybe we could win this election. And so you get kind of the sense of where that's coming from. Now, Nixon himself was actually publicly distancing himself from being involved in any of this. But it was clear that people who were very close to him, and we could probably suspect he was talking to, were leading the charge on this.
Well, if you look at it most cynically, I mean, Nixon did what you should do if you're a decent politician, which is publicly distance yourself from this and then enable or at least look the other way as all the people around you push forward, unlike Donald Trump, who is, I think, a very bad politician in that, at the very least, if he wants to pull off something like this, he's unable to sort of keep his nose out of it and keep his Twitter fingers out of it.
Yeah, and that taint around the 1960 election, it lasts, right? Yeah. It lasts, first of all, for a month from the election. There are still headlines in December of 1960 that say things like, Illinois, 27 votes remain in doubt, GOP still charging fraud in Chicago tally. But years later, decades later, there were still people who were talking about the way that Illinois was stolen. The historian Bob Dallek writes that Daley probably stole Illinois from Nixon. Now, that wouldn't have changed the results of the election, but that belief that something bad had to have happened if there was this much investigation into it is lasting effect of this tactic.
And I want to hold that thought because I want to come back to that a little bit because I think it is really fascinating and has parallels for right now. But just in terms of what went down in 60 and 61, because there are also lots of other little details here. I mean, this is a story I didn't really know about, but you look at some of the details and, yes, so the Nixon Recount Committee goes in front of the Illinois State Board of Elections and basically tries to pressure them to overturn the result. And then in other places, they're trying to do recounts. I mean, it is the same playbook in many ways that you see today, which is going down into these states and taking different sorts of tactics. And as I said, cobbling together this big narrative of suspicion that hopefully just sort of, I think the strategy is to just move the window of opinion over the course of the time between when the election happens and when it gets certified. The difference here, of course, is that it does get certified. Was there anything rocky in that process?
Sort of. I mean, there's another way that the results of the election were being interfered with, and that had to do with what was happening in Alabama and Mississippi. They had 14 electors who were supposed to vote for John Kennedy because those two states had gone Democratic, and yet they were holding their votes. The plan was, if it was a close enough election in the Electoral College, that by withholding their votes, they would be able to get the election thrown to the House of Representatives, and they were hoping for one or two outcomes based on that. One, that they could leverage those votes to get a promise from whoever would eventually win that they wouldn't move forward on civil rights. Or two, just picking who they wanted to become president and vice president. They wanted Robert Byrd and Barry Goldwater, a segregationist and a conservative, to be president and vice president. And they ultimately cast their votes for Byrd. It just didn't change the final results.
Yeah. So, it's like trying to use this moment as a political cudgel or if not, trying to win through the sort of mechanics of the Electoral College. Again, we see that here. So the legacy of this, I mean, I think to your point, we just have this story about, for at least a big group of people, about this election as being one that was suspicious going on. I certainly think this probably is an early element in Nixon's paranoia about the political process, which blooms. Those seeds obviously bloom into
right flower over
into
the
a
next
right
decade.
flower, exactly. But it is interesting that you can see, like Nixon, as much as he maybe distanced himself from this, you can probably see in here this sense of like, oh, the world's out to get me. But the bigger thing that I think about is, kind of like elections, especially close elections in this country, are messy. Like, there are things like machine politics. There are, maybe not outright fraud, but when you're dealing with this many votes, like things slip through the cracks, or there's reporting errors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think we want to protect our elections. We want to do it right. We want to improve our systems. We want to have better ballots, all these things. But at some level, it is also about like leadership and norms and kind of not actively poisoning a sort of well of trust in this. And that basically, like I would say for any election, if you choose to, you can probably create a real stink. And I think we've seen over time, people choose to do that and not choose to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would highlight two other lessons. One is very much related to that, and that is that we tend to whitewash the history of voting in the United States. But voting in, say, the late 19th century was full of fraud and ballot box stuffing and exclusion, so many people who weren't allowed, violence. And even as you get into, the 19-teens, you start to get the secret ballot. You still have machine politics where there is a lot of fraud, a lot of politics that we wouldn't accept today. And we have moved over the course of the 20th and early 21st century to more inclusive elections and to less fraudulent elections. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind, especially over the past decade when the language of voter fraud has become so prominent and so politically potent, is that we're actually in an era in which voter access, though under threat, has grown significantly, and voter fraud is actually much, much, much less part of the political process than it was even just 50 or 60 years ago.
It's also all of these conversations, every election about disenfranchisement and questions about the vote, reflect also who has the power to even ask those questions, right? I mean, we have all these conversations about voter fraud and election problems, and many of the people who actually are victims of disenfranchisement efforts, or at least the fallout of poorly run elections, are people who don't have power and don't even have the opportunity to raise a stink, and that's often Black and brown voters and women for much of this country's history. And so, I think, again, as always, these moments reflect the existing power dynamics as much as anything else.
Yeah, and if there's one final lesson, this was the moment at which there was a lot of conversation about doing away with the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And it led to a really popular push to do away with it. That didn't happen.
How'd that go? Yeah. Didn't turn out?
Just keep hope alive as we move into 2021.
Yeah, stay tuned, listeners. You will see whether the Electoral College was abandoned or not. But yeah, we did do an episode about another moment in which that happens, often in the wake of messy elections. There have been these sort of fundamental questions about how we run these things, and we will see what 2021 brings. Okay, let's leave it there. Let's do one also on this day, 1925. Nellie Taylor Ross of Wyoming becomes the first female governor in the United States. We recently reran our episode about Wyoming being the first state to give women the vote. So what's up with Wyoming?
Wyoming, the capital of feminism in the United States. That should be its state motto. We should look into getting that changed.
Yeah, okay. All right, that's it for this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at our website, thisdaypod.com. While you are there, you can also fill out a form and send us a question or comment about the show. We are getting lots of great suggestions already for things to talk about in 2021. We are building our list. You can also email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. For all of you who made a New Year's resolution to leave more ratings and reviews for podcasts, you can do that on Apple Podcasts. We really do appreciate all the ratings and reviews. They help others discover the show. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.